welcome. Wednesday night, huh? Welcome and having a good night, I hope. Thanks for coming up and showing up. Please share widely. Got an interesting little show here. Hey Danielle, how are you? We got, let's see, Sadie and Shane Sousa and Lily. Good to see you. Colorado Mountain Girl, yes, good to see you. Bella the Bayou on Rumble, my Rumble fan. Thank you. And Jacob Castro was on Rumble earlier, but we have kind of an interesting little show today, and I put it together. I haven't been streaming as much. I mean, obviously, I'm very busy working in private practice, doing civil defense work. But hey, Vice Baby, good to see you. And so it's been hard for me to stream, but occasionally I get an interesting, inspired idea, and sometimes somebody suggests this inspired idea. And in this case, this was somebody who knows me, I guess, through my writings or my streaming or something, and reached out to me and asked me some questions. And they're working as an intern for a particular policy group, and are working on freedom, on policy prescriptions to improve freedom. So without further ado, I'm going to bring him on. Now he's going to remain anonymous and we'll talk, but we're going to have a nice discussion. And I really want the chat's input on these ideas. So without further ado, it's the Chungster. Mr. Chungster.
How's it going?
Good. So tell me about your project and what you're looking for me and for the chat.
Of course. So I am doing this project for 1776 Law Center, which is a legal organization founded by attorney Robert Barnes. You might be familiar with him. He's sort of in the generic law tube space. And 1776 Law Center basically centers around what they call the four freedoms, which would be food freedom, medical freedom, political freedom, and financial freedom. And today we're specifically going to be talking about political freedom. I am doing this project kind of on my own volition, but I'm doing it to help 1776 Law Center. And I am familiar with you, Steve, from your appearances on different shows like Nick Ricada, like Andrew Branca, and all of the others. And I figured that you would be an amazing person to talk to about ideas for meaningful policy legislations to support both at the state and federal level for political freedom, which encompasses everything from free speech to Second Amendment rights, to censorship, to basically everything that doesn't fall in the other three categories.
Fair enough. And I'll say that, I've worked very hard in my life whenever I speak or in public or even when I'm thinking. I mean, I like, it's good to talk about problems and political problems and social problems, but everybody's got an opinion on the problem that's out there. But what is the solution? And I think it's incumbent upon us to really work hard to have solutions. And that's why I thought that you had it inspired me a little bit when you were thinking, and I just inspired us to have a discussion. Now I want to invite the rewatch crew also to comment to this video. So if this discussion if it gets you thinking and you're on part of the rewatch crew and you aren't in the chat, then please do add in ideas to share, because Mr. Chungster here is going to take whatever ideas we have. Maybe it'll become part of something. And so let's talk about some solutions to problems. And there's some ideas that I have that are probably not practical, or I don't know how we could get from here to there given the state of things. I mean, it's hard because you just perceive the structures and the systems as they are as immovable, right? But being creative, somebody had asked about the criminal justice system. And I had a couple suggestions for improving the criminal justice system. And one of them was we should, every, say, 3 years, the prosecutors and the public defenders should switch jobs so that they understand. And I think they do that in England. Like England, they show up and they don't know which side they're going to be on. I think there becomes this, we're the good guys and they're the bad guys on both sides. That comes from the defense side as well as the prosecutor side. And I think that's unhealthy. I think it's better to understand humanity and to understand the perspectives of your opponent. That improves the understanding, improves the system. So that would be kind of reform. I know how that could be accomplished. I don't know, but that's something that I think would help tone down the rhetoric, right? Another one,
Yeah.
here's another idea I had, and I'm just gonna blast a lot of the things that I had that are ideas, and that is a big problem. And I think I sent you ideas and answers in law, and I had some public policy prescriptions to prosecutors, because prosecutors are not held to account for bad behavior. And I was shocked when I got into this internet and watching trials, how many bad prosecutors, how widespread it is, right? How unethical conduct by prosecutors is just widespread. So I would say that whenever an appellate attorney files an ethical, basically says either ineffective assistance of counsel by a defense attorney or prosecutorial misconduct in an appellate brief, there should be like a mandatory reporting system from the appellate judges. So the appellate court should pick up on that and mandatorily report that to the bar, to have them at least review it for ethical violations. So let me pick up a super chat here. JKD Buck 76. We love you, Wizard of Gods. Well, thank you. I love you guys too. And I wish I was more able to give more than what I am, but I've been through a lot, and I'm trying to make money and trying to work and practice. So those are a couple of thoughts. What do you have? Like, what are your initial thoughts or some of the stuff that you've come up with so far?
Absolutely. And I guess before I say that, I see in the chat, Mr. Scott Awesome says, "Is it ish time?" And it absolutely is. And then Lord of the Ree says, "Lampposts exist, just saying." I very much agree. Lampposts exist. But sometimes it's dark and you need lampposts to shed light on the situation. That's definitely what this individual was referring to. But yeah, so I actually have compiled a list of potential sort of ideas, ranging from like very broad, generic ideas to very specific policy proposals. And so we can go through those one by
let's
one.
go through them one by one, and then maybe I'll just
Yeah.
react, and it'll inspire my thinking as a conversation. And then
Yeah.
the chat can jump in, and if somebody says something with some wisdom, we'll put it up, and or if super chats it, then we'll definitely put it up, and we'll just go from there. So what's number one? What's the big one?
Absolutely. And actually, they're not in a particular order. So the way I organized this, I actually had it originally. I have a master list for all of the policy proposals for all four of the freedoms. So then I extracted the ones that are specifically for political freedom. So they're not in any particular order. So we're just going to kind of go through it. And they're just completely random. So we're just going to go one by one, and we can see where everything takes us. So the first one is about civil asset forfeiture, and generally that maybe it should not be a thing, or it should at least have higher standards. So I have as example in Nebraska in 2016, and then at the federal level last year or 2 years ago, there were proposals to end civil asset forfeiture. I think in Nebraska it actually passed. Some states are doing it where they're requiring maybe a higher standard. So rather than probable cause or preponderance of the evidence, they're requiring clear and convincing evidence or some other higher burden. Or in other cases, they're just requiring there must be a criminal conviction before a seizure of property occurs. And I just feel like that's something that is reasonable to be addressed. What do you think?
There's some, I mean, I'll weigh in against that for a second, and I don't know where I stand on that, but the first is that if you paid an incentive to get a criminal conviction, now you're rewarding the state for getting criminal convictions, and it's very easy to get criminal convictions. So you're making it even more burdensome for people who are fighting the state. You're giving more incentives for the state to continue to prosecute when they should. John, I would also say that the basis for the civil convictions, and we're in Miami, and I'm in Miami now, and Miami Vice was a thing, and Miami Vice was inspired by that forfeiture system, because when Michael Mann found out that these cops were riding around in Scarab speedboats, And like, how do they do that? Well, because the drug dealers would have these really good equipment, and they came up with this law in which they would surrender the equipment to the state so that the drug dealers weren't outclassing the state. There is a basis, because you don't want the criminals and organized crime to have such powerful assets and such money that they can outdo the state. So there is a basis for it. But I get the fact that it's abused. I'm not certain that the change in the burden is effective either, because I don't think anybody really pays attention to burdens of proof. I think people just go like, well, he did it. Well, yeah, but I mean, like a lot of my cases, people say, well, how do you represent the guilty people? And I said, well, some of my people are actually innocent, and those are pretty small number within the public defender system. But I'd say that there's a good number of people that are convicted when I say that they did not do it beyond a reasonable doubt, that I think the burden of proof was not held. Although I can't say they're actually innocent, I can say that they're not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But people tend to say, well, I think he did it, so that's enough. So I'm not sure if the burden of proof. So I'm throwing up some flack on that idea, but those are some criticisms. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think absolutely those are very real considerations to be had. I would say maybe we would want to think about, maybe if something is not sufficient to achieve the goal, it doesn't mean it's not necessary, right? So just because there is the ability for, let's say, if we require criminal prosecution, if that means that it allows prosecutors to then charge for more, but that's just the case with everything, right? So in order to put someone in prison, you need a criminal conviction. So is that incentivizing prosecutors to pursue criminal charges? I guess maybe, but what is the alternative? Just like, because for example, we have, in the civil asset forfeiture system, there are obviously examples where you just have, law enforcement taking property without anything. And that's like a direct Fifth Amendment violation. And so the question is,
I will say Volusia County, we were in Daytona Beach, we were kind of the epicenter of the original civil forfeiture stuff. We had a sheriff, what was his name? We had a sheriff who would get tips. He had connections in law enforcement from South Florida, and he would get tips on the cars that were traveling up at I-95, and he'd look for them. And it's like, there's two guys, in a car loaded down with a trunk driving 80 miles an hour up I-95, and he'd stop them. And then they'd find like, $500,000 in cash behind the seat. And then they'd say, well, hey buddy, do you know about this? And of course they're like, no, we don't know anything about it. It's like, okay, well, you want a receipt? We'll take the cash and you can go, or we'll give you a receipt and you can claim. And then they'd say, oh, no, take the cash. And so it was a big thing because they were doing these stops on I-95, and it became a big thing. And what's his name? Bob Vogel was his name. Bob Vogel. And he was really one of the cutting edge guys. That was in Daytona Beach, Florida. So a lot of this is driven by the drug trade.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Let me say hi to some people. I see that there's a number of good people. We had Mr. Buck, and we got Danielle here, and Lord of the Ree, and Jacob Castro did show up. Ahoy, where he is. And Kaiser Pineapple's here. Lord of the Ree is a good guitar player. Vice Baby, of course, I don't know if you know, Amerifan. And Boosh McFadden, good to see you. All sorts of good folks. Slidey Pie, she read a couple of my books on her stream, and including my R-rated novel, crime novel. And so good to see you. And let's see who else is here. So, anyways, I just wanted to say hello to some of the people. All right. Well, what's number 2?
Yeah, absolutely. So this next one, and I'm going to preface this by, a lot of these policy proposals come directly from cases or clients that 1776 Law Center has been involved in defending. And so for when that is relevant, I'll mention the context. So this one is relating to key TAM actions against the federal government, or meaning on behalf of the federal government under the False Claims Act. And this comes from 1776 Law Center representing Brooke Jackson, who was a whistleblower during the Pfizer trials for the licensure of the COVID shot. And basically she made whistleblower disclosures about basically the fact that they were not conducting proper scientific trials for the licensing, and then she was retaliated against. And so she brought a Ketam claim, which is, I guess, for the people who are not familiar, it's basically when a private party is bringing an action against another party on behalf of the U.S. government for someone who's basically defrauded them. And the specific policy proposal here is that basically what happened under the Biden DOJ, and unfortunately it's still kind of happening under the Bondi DOJ, is that the Department of Justice joined the suit because obviously they are a party, but they joined the suit solely for the purpose of dismissing it, arguing that there is no way that this could have, like, basically that Brooke Jackson can't sue on behalf of the federal government because the federal government views as a matter of opinion that there is no possible way that anything could be wrong with any vaccines ever. And so they joined the suit simply to dismiss it. And so this is a very like niche.
That's a very, I'll throw out one that maybe is related to that. Maybe it's not, I don't know, but it got me thinking as you were talking. And that is, I've seen that, a big problem here is centralized power, the state power, and the distrust and the de-evolution of morality or trust in our institutions generally. And so institutional destruction and has really impacted a lot of this. And I mean, kind of is at the root of a lot of this. And so I'm not sure changing the system helps. But one of the ideas was, a lot of what happens is you'd get like the federal government, the Department of Justice, say, and they would sue a city and say that the lefties are on both sides of it. And then they'd enter into a consent decree.
Oh, yeah, those are big.
Achieve some sort of political policy goal, like, to have the feds take over a police force or have them do sort of some kind of quota. But because the DOJ and the party they're suing are both in on it, and they come up with a consent decree, and all of a sudden it's law and it's binding and everybody has to follow it. That, to me, that's a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I believe it was Harmeet Dillon who went on the Tucker Carlson podcast and talked about how there were a lot of these lefty jurisdictions where they're basically enacting laws through these consent decrees, gutting the ability of law enforcement to do sort of anything meaningful to combat crime. And it's kind of an interesting situation because we find ourselves here in a country where the actual criminals are not prosecuted and then ordinary citizens are prosecuted. And so I feel like one of the traps that people on the right get stuck in is this idea of like, oh, the liberals want weak police and weak prosecutors. And it's like, no, they want very strong police and prosecutors to go against you and your family and your churchgoers, who are praying outside of an abortion clinic, but they want weak enforcement against actual criminals. And so it's a very interesting situation where
they weaponize it. And because good people who are law-abiding citizens are easy targets. They're easy money targets. They're easy to deal with. They're easy to, and real criminals, that's hard to deal with. They're tricky and they're violent and all. Who wants to fight those people, right? So they go. I hate to be so cynical, but that's a problem. Yeah, these consent decrees should definitely go. I'm gonna, we're talking political freedom. I'm gonna go take a big curve here, and it's probably on your list, but I was part of a law firm that was involved with the Bush v. Gore decision way back when. And
okay.
The hanging
chads.
So I was observed the recount in Volusia County and when they did that. And I will say I was really impressed by the Volusia County system. And what they had is they had the ballots, and you'd ink the ballot, you'd have a pen and you'd mark the ballot, and they could be scanned. But at the end of the scan, you've got a big pile of ballots, and you've got, when you sign in, you sign your name. And so you've got 100 people signing their names. And then you've got 100 ballots, and it can be reconciled. And then if you want to go back, you can count each one, 1, 2, 3, and you can say. So I really think, as a matter of political freedom, there needs to be paper ballots that can be reconciled and recounted the way that I saw it done in Florida. back in, and since then we've improved it. I do not believe in any kind of system that's electronic, because those electronic systems are innately inferior, as well as I think it should also be the mail-in ballot thing should be tightly constrained to only like people abroad and military, that sort of thing. You've got to go through a formal process rather than this just write a letter. And we really need to get a fix on election fraud, and the way to do that is to have verifiable paper ballots.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Robert Barnes was one of the attorneys hired by the Trump administration in the Georgia election contest in 2020, alongside Paul Dans and Cleta Mitchell and others. And so he's very well versed in this issue. So actually, a lot of the election security stuff is part of this. So, for example, one of the biggest things that he observed, and one of our biggest proposals, is to have meaningful signature match checks in elections. Because kind of like you're saying, we have these processes of the mail-in ballots and whatnot. And so when they do a quote unquote recount or an audit of the election, they're just basically recounting the same numbers that they already counted. And so obviously they're not going to find any material fraud because they're just doing the same thing over again. But actually what the law requires, and what actually did not happen in Georgia and in other states in 2020, is that there were not meaningful signature match verifications. And so, like, for example, in the Arizona election contest, I think this would have been in 2022 for Kari Lake's run for governor. This one actually went to the Arizona Supreme Court, and they did a signature match check. But what they did was, and they basically found out that when the checkers were looking at the signatures, they were basically just scrolling through and just checking at the very end, like, okay, we checked the signatures. And because, judges are going to defer to state power, they basically were like, yep, this is a fine signature match check, even though they didn't actually check the signatures.
It needs to be, that's why it needs to be in-person voting on
Absolutely.
election day with paper ballots, so that I come to the voter office, I show my ID, and it can be a driver's license, it can be a issued ID, it can be whatever, but I show an ID, I sign in, and I get my paper ballot and I vote in person. That should be the default way on election day. And then there can be some, like military mail-ins and stuff like that, but it needs to be tightly constrained. And because the election system is the core of the authority, I think somebody's commented,
absolutely,
governed. And if you strike at that, if people don't believe in that, then the whole system is flawed. And so I think, to me, I'd put real close to the top of the list of reforms that need now is verifiable in-person written paper ballot voting as a priority across the country.
Absolutely. And also the counting of the ballots. So the fact that Florida can count every single vote in a single night, but California takes weeks to count. And it's fascinating, right? Because it's always, they never find extra Republican ballots, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later. They always magically find extra Democrat ballots when they're still counting weeks later. So it's just like
Florida, and Bush v. Gore really put us through the ringer, and we got a lot of criticism, but the current system in Florida is very good. And I have a lot of confidence in it, because I said, I witnessed the way it should be done, because, okay, at the end of the day, you've got all the precincts, and the precincts have their voter logs, and everybody's signed in, everybody's had the thing, and you have a pile of paper ballots. And what they did is they took them one by one, and there'd be a Democrat, a Republican, and a third party that was elected by both, and all the public looking at it, and they'd put the ballot up there, and they'd say, this is a vote for Mickey Mouse, okay? And then they'd say, we vote that this is not a valid ballot. They'd raise their hand, right? And then they'd say, okay. And then you'd have one that would be like, this guy voted for everybody. This is an invalid ballot. There's undervote. And it was really, I thought it was an impressive, but they could check it because they had a pile of ballots that matched the signatures out of each precinct, and they knew exactly where each one came from. And, and it prevents from having like, well, yeah, these are all the precincts. And then we've got 20,000 ballots from the inner city here who just magically appear because there's people in there, and they closed. All very bad. That's a very bad thing. So I would put that near the top of my priority list for preserving individual freedom in the United States.
Absolutely. And in the chat here, Shosarian Fraud mentions that basically this person thinks that they denied the election challenges because they knew that soon the evidence would be destroyed. I would add to that, one of the biggest problems in the Georgia election contest, and this ties generally into the narrative of the 2020 presidential election. You'll hear people who sort of support the regime say something like, there were this many lawsuits brought about the election and every single one failed. But what actually happened was that there was not a single actual meaningful trial on the merits in any single one of the challenges. And what they do, and this ties into one of the other proposals, is eliminating this Pontius Pilate standard of it's either it's not ripe or you lack standing. And then once it passes, you have to sue once it passes. And then once it passes, it's moot. And then after that, it's latches.
I agree. Once the fraud has been committed, it's too late. The system needs to be much stronger up front to protect it from invading, like having a computer machine that you push the touch screen and it just tallies in some electronic form. That's crap. I don't want that. I want a paper ballot that I mark and that you can check and that piles up. And that is a check, because it's so easy. I don't trust these computers at all. So that's my number one. So we've exhausted that one. What's your next one on your list?
Absolutely. So this one, it goes back to the Kyle Rittenhouse case. And Mr. Barnes was originally on the legal team for that, but he was not at trial. And so he was kind of involved in the court of public opinion. And basically the idea is that Kyle was charged with a violation of Wisconsin's carry provision because he was under the age of 18 and he was openly carrying. And I think basically sort of under the Second Amendment and just under common law, the defense of acting in self-defense should be an absolute defense to the carry provisions themselves. So, I mean, that's just like an idea I'm spitballing here.
What do you mean the carry provisions? I don't.
So in many states, there are laws against the public carry of firearms. Now, in some states, then they require a permit. In some states, they don't, and that depends on whether. And I remember you mentioned one of these, that you had one article in your criminal law answers. Ideas and answers about the concealed carry of a firearm in a vehicle.
Right.
And it's a similar thing, but specifically that if someone is charged under the carrying a firearm in public, but they were acting in self-defense in the moment, then I feel like that should be
I don't know if that's a problem now. It may be in other jurisdictions. I mean, I live in Florida, and Florida's a very, I'd say, pro-gun state generally, although it's a little bit of a mistake because
it's actually not that much of a pro-gun state.
What's that?
A lot of the laws, Florida actually, of the Republican states, has some of the strictest gun laws. For example, open carry is completely banned.
Well, actually, you're quite right about this. We're kind of schizophrenic on the thing, because on the one hand, I'd say we're very pro-gun. On the other, the penalties for wrongful uses of firearm are so incredibly harsh that I'm very much against 1020 life in Florida. That was one of Jeb Bush's things, and Jeb Bush was one of our best governors we've ever had, I would say. But he was a terrible presidential candidate, but he was a great governor. But I got to say, I really disagree. And 1020 life has been a disaster for lawful gun ownership and gun carrying. But I will say, I have strong opinions on this stuff, and I'm a big Second Amendment guy. But I think that concealed carry is the way to go. I'm not certain that open carry is the best. And there's a variety of reasons for that. If you have a choice between open carry and concealed carry, I'd much rather see a concealed carry state. And the reason is because criminals can identify you with who are the people who have guns. They could dispossess you of that gun without your knowledge. They have the drop on you and can surprise attack you. And further, concealed carry, you never know. Even if there's not a gun present in the entire building, the possibility that somebody is concealed carrying is a deterrent to crime. So as opposed to open carry, which you know who's carrying and who's not, and there's a certain open and carry antagonism that can be had, and also the fact that usually concealed carry firearms are smaller caliber or smaller weapons, and so you don't have the problem of terrorists walking around in front of schools with rifles and who all of a sudden take advantage of the open carry permit. So I tend to be a fan of concealed carry for basically law-abiding citizens. Good people should carry guns. Good people. I want all the good folks to be carrying guns who are mentally and physically qualified and who have good personalities. You should be carrying, because good people with weapons protect. But I'm not a big fan of open carry.
So
go ahead.
I think that's reasonable. First, I'm going to address M. Logan 8 in the comments corrected the record, saying open carry is allowed when hunting, fishing, and transit to and from. That is absolutely true. In Florida, they have that provision where open carry is technically allowed if you're hunting and fishing. And if you look at the YouTube videos. Can
I jump in real quick? Just hold that thought. But this is Murray Logan. He is a law student currently at FAMU in Orlando, right? And he's going to be a great lawyer. I've talked to him a couple of times, and he is actually the guy on the back of my book, Death Penalty Debates. I think you've got the quote in there. So he's the cover quote commenter. So good to see you, Murray, and he's going to be a great lawyer. All right. So I'm sorry.
So yeah, that is. And there's actually YouTube videos of people in Florida who are fishing. They call themselves like auditors, and they openly carry while fishing. And it's kind of funny. But So real quick, and then also this Hunter Brooks person, I'm not sure what you mean by confusing open carry with open carry. I don't know if that was a typo or maybe I'm not understanding the question. But yeah, what you're saying about open carry, I agree tactically, right? As a person who's carrying a firearm, it makes a lot more sense to be carrying concealed. But I think we don't want to conflate, what is tactically like prudent versus what should be punishable by law. And I would just add a few things. Number one, more states in the union allow permitless open carry, including of long guns, than concealed carry. And historically, open carry has actually been treated more as a more core Second Amendment right than concealed carry. So while I agree with you strategically, tactically, it's not the right decision to open carry, I think that doesn't take away from the fact that if the right exists, right, then someone shouldn't be, thrown in a cage simply for doing something that is unwise. And I agree with you, we don't want terrorists walking around, schools or whatever, openly carrying.
On the other hand, I mean,
that's not actually something that happens a lot.
I'm going to argue against myself because I'm a lawyer.
Okay.
But I would say that on the other hand, you also have these riot situations. And I think about the rooftop Koreans. The rooftop Koreans were open carrying, right?
Right.
Should they all be criminal? And nowadays, California would probably prosecute them all.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So I mean, there does need to be, and I really think this, and I don't know where this comes, and I don't know where this fits into your rubric, but this idea, this mob attack, these criminal mobs, and when they mob cars,
yeah, that's a big one.
That has got to be addressed. Now, I know that Florida has a different view, and in different states have it, but that kind of thing is very threatening. And then everybody's like, oh my God, he ran over somebody. It's like, yeah, when you're all this mob is attacking the car and beating it, and everybody's got their phones out waiting for the reaction, and then the guy's afraid and he runs off in his car, and then he hits somebody as he's running away because he's afraid. It's like, oh, he's a criminal, and look, we got him. I mean, there's something really pathologically wrong about that scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that I've learned a lot from following the work of Andrew Branca from Law of Self-Defense, because he's the law of self-defense guy. And I think that's first of all, that is a specific thing that I have in my list, which is that there should be some sort of either jury instruction or provision where it is a presumption that, because as Andrew Branca says, in self-defense you have 5 elements: innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance, and reasonableness. And avoidance is only present in certain states where that's necessary. But I feel like it should be added as a provision where it is a rebuttable presumption that someone was facing a reasonable imminent risk if they are, for example, surrounded by a mob. So like in the Kyle Rittenhouse case, I mean, arguably that should have never even been charged, let alone gone to trial, let alone, survived any motion to dismiss or whatever. But the fact that it is not like a very definitive, decided, like if you were surrounded by a rioting mob, just because they're only setting cars on fire and not like hitting people, that doesn't mean that you're not at fear for your life.
Well, and
so I feel like,
everybody, I don't know if how old you are, but the Reginald Denny situation was a good example of, like, I don't know if you look up Reginald Denny in the LA riots, he was dragged out of his truck and beaten with a brick in the head. And I mean, and people remember that. And that is what the mob wants to do to you. They want to kill you. They want to destroy you. And they want to use the mob as anonymous protection. And everybody's got their little cell phones out. There's this Antifa tactic. There's got to be some major that's a major problem. Anyways, we've identified that. And since you mentioned Andrew Branca, I will tell you, my buddy, he's going to be in Miami next week. And I expect that I will be on a live stream with him. We're going to take him out to dinner, and my family, although my son's really shy, he's like, I don't want to be on the stream. But I said, well, so and Branca had a little, the last stream I was on with Branca, he said, if they donate enough money, we'll do a stream from the restaurant. So I can tell you that we are going to be going to dinner next week, and we will be doing a short little stream. I don't know if it'll be on my stream, probably on Branca's stream from the restaurant. So just wanted to, you brought up Branca. He's a great guy, and he would be very proud that the elements of self-defense.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like he definitely puts it in he encapsulated it in a very strategic, very rigorous way. And I feel like I'm drawn to a lot of the people who have this sort of subject matter expertise in a particular field, like Branca. He has such an eloquent way of explaining those elements of self-defense.
Yes, he is, I'd say, the premier self-defense expert in the United States, and really, and he's very. And I would, how we met was when I was in the public defender's office, and I saw his coverage of the trial in Sanford, the Zimmerman case. And it's so hard. It was such a politicized case. And then I read that he was commenting on legal insurrection about that case. And it was like, this is the only guy that knows what he's talking about. I mean, and so I sent an email, and then of course, and he's like, oh, thanks, and then we got to know each other. And I passed a number of self-defense cases by him when I was in the public defender's office. So, and he's always got a very interesting take and a very thoughtful take. So, well, let's see, what's next on your list?
Absolutely. So we said right self-defense against a mob. I would say, so Florida specifically, and you would be familiar with this, has, as part of their quote unquote stand your ground law, has the self-defense immunity provision, where if self-defense is raised by the defendant, there is a pretrial hearing.
Yes.
The separate hearing where self-defense immunity is the discussion. And I think there's a burden on the defendant of clear and convincing evidence.
Well, this is interesting. It's funny because actually I really like our stand your ground law in Florida. Yeah. I think I had the first trial in all of Florida where the stand your ground defense was brought. And it was interesting because the law had just been passed and was just going into effect. And the defense attorney, I was prosecuting, and the defense attorney got wind of this and said, hey, this is an immunity provision. Somebody whispered in his ear. I don't think he came up with it on his own. Maybe I'm wrong, but just before trial, before we started picking a jury, this is a little bit of a story, but you'll indulge me, please.
I love stories.
So he says, Your Honor, we want a stand your ground immunity hearing. All right. And this was Judge Richard O. Watson, who was my mentor, who was I think the greatest judge I've ever been in front of, bar none. The courthouse up in St. Augustine is named after him. And he was a good friend of mine. He was a big supporter of mine. And he was kind of my mentor and always encouraged me to be a judge and was such a great friend. Loved Judge Watson. I had probably 25 jury trials in front of Judge Watson. Brilliant, the best judge ever, right? Well, this is you got to know this, and I admired it. But Watson was like, you want what? And the defense attorney says, I want a self-defense immunity hearing based on the statute. And then the judge says, you mean you want a trial before the trial? We're about to pick a jury? And he's like, denied. right? And so, but KGO Watson, this is what happened. So we do this trial. It was a 4-day jury trial. It had 38 witnesses. It was a big trial. It had everything. It was a great trial. I used it as a training tool when I was in criminal, because there were so many good examples of different issues. And in the end, after the end of the presentation of the evidence, and before we were doing the jury, old KG Watson had looked up this statute and he had read it. And he's like, you know what? And he comes back and he says, counselor, do you have any motions? He says, yeah, I move for judgment of acquittal. And he's like, well, I'm gonna reopen your motion for stand your ground hearing because I've read the statute. And he says that I'm going to consider the trial, the evidence presented as trial, as the evidence in the stand your ground hearing. And I'm going to consider that, and I'm going to deny your motion for stand your ground based on the evidence that I heard before me. It's pretty cagey. That was a good judge move because, and then later on, I went to the prosecutor's office. I went to the public defender's office in the appellate division, and the guy that case got 10 years, and it went to appeal, and I worked with the guy who did the defense on the appeal of my case, right? And I told him, I said, I was the prosecutor in that case. And he was so upset because I appealed that case and they should have ruled for me because that was a stand your ground. They should have been given the stand your ground. You're like, oh, yeah, but you had a cagey old Judge Watson that saved it. And it was funny because like 6 months later, a case came down that said that you're entitled to a self-defense immunity hearing beforehand, in which the state has the burden to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt, right? And that came out afterwards. He's like, that should have been my decision. He was so upset. And so that was my stand your ground story. So I think I had the first case in all of Florida where a stand your ground hearing was asked for. So how's that for cool?
That's a great story.
And the provision is that if you win your stand your ground hearing, not only are you immune from criminal suit, you're also immune from civil action, which I remember that.
Yeah. So I actually have two things in response to that. But first, Justin Credible says in the chat, talking about the right to self-defense for people convicted of nonviolent felonies. I 100% agree with that. I think that the text, history, and tradition of Second Amendment jurisprudence in this country strongly supports, not fully punishing people forever for nonviolent crimes, stripping them of their rights. And I would even go one further, that we should consider some sort of limitation on the imposition of prison sentences, or at least the severity thereof, for nonviolent offenses. This kind of ties into what you were saying about the 1020 life provision. Mandatory minima in general basically allows no upper limit on sentence, but a lower limit. So, the judge could be as strict as they want, but for even some technical violation, someone can be sent, to a cage for a certain amount of years for something that boils down to, doing something they quote unquote weren't supposed to, but not that actually harmed anyone.
Well, let's talk about a little bit about my thoughts on that. And I'm not a public official. I'm not doing criminal law anymore. So to hell with it. I'll tell you what I think. And I don't represent any government entity or anything. But
and then real quick, we'll then jump back to my responses to what you were saying about that. Because it reminded me of what you were saying in your book about affirmative defenses and the burden shifting in affirmative defenses, as well as judge discretion. But yeah, you can keep going.
Oh, well, no, I was just saying that we have something called a criminal punishment code score sheet, right?
Mm-hmm. Minnesota has the same thing.
Yeah, and I really kind of like the score sheet because one of the ideas behind the score sheet is that, we don't want racial disparities in sentencing. You don't want so it's like, okay, well,
any disparities.
Yeah, or disparities. So let's come up with the factors that should be considered in sentencing, and let's have let's list those things and let's assign scores to them. And it's a little complicated, it's score sheets, you have to learn it, but once you learn it, it makes a lot of sense, and it gives you a minimum mandatory sentencing, and it gives you a sentencing range. And I kind of like it because it's fair, it's predictable, and it should be the deferred kind of go-to thing. But then the problem is, then on top of that, it's like, well, we're not tough enough on crime because somebody got away with something. And so then they add these minimum mandatories like the 1020 life to the score sheet. So it's like, well, okay, the score sheet's great, but now we're adding something that, well, didn't we already consider that in the score sheet? But now you've got, well, because it's this, why is it like murder with a gun is any worse than murder with a knife? I mean,
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, I wish they would do away with all the extraneous stuff. But the problem is it's always politicians who are posing for being tough on crime. And so something happens with
Absolutely.
some media case, and they say, well, this, I need to be, I would do more tough. And so I'm going to pass a law that says Justice for Kaylee Act and the Justice for Jimmy Act. And, and then
Yep.
it's like, it keeps amping up and there's never goes the other direction. I think it needs to be
Absolutely.
kind of cleaned out. I mean, I don't know how to explain that, but
And
what do
that's
you
kind
think?
of something I raised earlier, where it's like you're saying, it's these politicians and prosecutors will claim to be quote unquote tough on crime. But then when it comes down to it, on the actual criminals, they're often, very gentle. But then, on the ordinary citizens who are kind of caught up in these things, they're the ones who get the butt end of the quote unquote tough on crime.
Yeah, I didn't quite experience that, but I think that's very jurisdictional dependent.
Right.
And what happens is that I don't know. Violent crime. My experience is prosecutors in Florida are very tough on violent crime, and I think for
Absolutely.
good
Yeah.
reason because that's what everybody fears. They get a fear of getting attacked, and so okay, I get it, but I don't know. I mean, that's a hard one. Like I said, I think the score sheet is pretty good in Florida, but I don't like all the other enhancements that add to it and give basically
Yeah.
prosecutors such power over the citizenry that you can just destroy people's lives over nothing. And I don't know. Well, what's the next issue? I want to kind of rock through because I know you've got a lot of issues, and this is a
Yeah, of course.
brainstorming session, right? We're
Well,
not
and
going to
we
solve
don't have to
all.
cover every single thing in this stream, but one of them was, and this kind of comes up in basically every single proceeding, which is mandatory cameras and live streams in every court proceeding, additionally at the federal level. Because, this is like when we watch these trials, and you've appeared alongside people like Nick Ricato who are streaming trials, and we see this sort of fact mentioned over and over. It's like, if this trial were not live streamed, the world would not be privy to the just utter either incompetence or malice or combination thereof of these wrongful prosecutions. And it's kind of like, especially in federal court, there's no cameras allowed, and somehow that's to quote unquote protect the system. But what that just does is obscures we have the right to a public trial under the Constitution. Historically trials were conducted outdoors, right, where anyone could kind of show up. And so I think under the right to public trial, there needs to be an enforcement of cameras in courtrooms. And, whatever, if there's children testifying and they need to hide that or whatever, those can be, remedied. But the fact that we just have secret trials happening, and in fact, 1776 Law Center and Robert Barnes is representing a woman right now who was criminally charged for recording her own court proceeding and exposing the fact that the court reporter fraudulently reported something, meaning reported something incorrectly. And she proved that with her own recording, and she was prosecuted and convicted for recording her own court proceeding under a technicality. And I feel like that's pretty ridiculous. And so having this radical transparency in the court process, I think, is important because, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Well, and I'll keep opining on that. And I've had I had an appeal that I took all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court on this issue at once, but I never didn't get the petition granted. But I think you should have an absolute right to record the police during the performance of their duties. And that's been under attack because and I'll say also the problem is the cameras. The state hates it because you get bad. Are you familiar with Jeff Gray and Honor Your Oath investigations?
I can't say that I am.
He goes to public places and holds up a sign, and it's a cardboard sign with a handwritten note on it. It says, "God bless the homeless vets."
Okay.
And so he goes to public forums, like in front of city halls, and he holds up the sign. He says, "God bless the homeless vets," and he stands out there, and then all the Karens of the world call and say, "There's a homeless guy out here who's soliciting and he's begging, and we got to, clean him up, get him off the public property," right? So the cops come, and then the cops will regularly sue or will arrest him and trespass him for simply saying, God bless the homeless vets. He doesn't even, it's ridiculous. It's called, it's auditors. He's an auditor, and he's I think he's the best auditor out there. Check him out, Honor Your Oath Investigations. And he's actually the grubby bum in my first chapter of the thing. It's Jeff Gray standing on the corner who's got a grubby bum. He's got a sign. He's great and really interesting. And it's amazing to show the level of tyranny that people are subjected to, that just average folks are subjected to, and really is important. And so I think cameras and on top, and so what I'm emphasizing the fact that cops in the performance of the public, when they're in uniform, they're on duty, you should have an absolute right to record them wherever they're sitting, they're on duty. Because what happens is that the cops in Florida, it's a two-party consent state, and they'll get in the face of the guy and says, I don't consent to being recorded, right? Yep. And then you'll be like, well, get out of my way. And it's like, and they get in their face, and it becomes this ego contest. So anyway.
Awesome. And then addressing what Hunter Brooks said a few minutes ago about asking me if I'm an attorney and if I have a Rumble, I do have an X and I have a Substack, and I am working on starting in the near future YouTube and Rumble, though I don't have those set up yet. So if you'd like to find me on X or Substack, you'll just find me by The Chunkster. I think on X I'm The Chunkster 1. Yeah, I'm not an attorney. No.
Yes, well, but you play one on the internet. But I know
I play one on the internet.
But you're a smart person, and you're a citizen of the United States, and you're entitled to opinions. And actually, just because you're not a lawyer, that doesn't mean you're not smart. Because I'll tell you, there's a lot of dumb lawyers out there, and I think there's a big problem that lawyers get this lawyer mentality sometimes that blinds them to reality.
And I would say on that topic, I think one thing that Mr. Barnes kind of talks about a lot, maybe not necessarily in the context of 1776 Law Center, although this is one of the provisions that I've thought about, is either significant reform or a complete end to a lot of the licensure provisions that require you, for example, to obtain a license to practice law, to practice medicine. And so maybe it would be a little extreme to some people to completely remove licensure, but some sort of reform, because what ends up happening is that, there are a lot of lawyers, and you can attest to this, that just because you went to law school and passed the bar does not by any means make you a competent, practicer of the law.
I'm dealing with one now. It's just, he's just terrible. And
so the licensure process is weaponized usually by these boards that are infested by these professional managerial class types who are then using the licensure as a sword rather than as a shield, and basically punishing anyone who steps out of the system. So this is, very prevalent in the medical context, right? Any of the doctors during COVID.
I think there's a bigger problem though, and that is the whole, and believe me, I know this is a personal experience, but is the whole idea of this cancel culture. For example, the doctors who spoke out against the party line were threatened. Their license was threatened, their careers were threatened, and they were threatened with cancellation. And this cultural phenomenon, and I don't know how this fits politically, but this idea that if somebody has an opinion that you disagree with that differs from the orthodoxy line, that they can be destroyed, has got to stop. That is just absolutely a horrific thing. And it happened to me. They took away my legal career in criminal law because they didn't like my religion. They didn't like my sex. They didn't like my politics. Right. So, but does that mean I'm not a competent lawyer? I mean, it's like, do I care? But it's like, if you can destroy somebody because you disagree with them politically and destroy their career, well, we're just going to destroy everybody. Everybody's going to be labeled. And I don't know would you have any ideas on how to solve that problem?
Well, so, I mean, Roberts recommends just to end licensure completely and kind of have this sort of informed consent system where you're enforcing fraud. So if someone says they went to law school, but they didn't, that's not allowed. But if you want to, as an informed adult citizen with rights, if you want to hire an attorney who is not licensed, maybe that should be allowed. And I would add, the cancellation through licensure happens a lot in the legal profession as well. For example, I mean, these two notable examples would be John Eastman, who represented President Trump and had his whole disbarment, his sham disbarment proceeding in California for just representing Trump. And then Norm Pattis, who was co-counsel with Robert Barnes in the Alex Jones defamation show trial. And he had his licensure removed also just for representing Alex Jones. And so we have this situation where attorneys are stripped of their licensure simply for representing clients who the government or who the leftist media doesn't like.
Right.
And
so this is the thing. Like, I represented people on death row in my appellate.
Absolutely.
Practice, right? I mean, they're the worst of the worst, right? So do the conservatives come back and say, if you represent murderers, we're going to take your license away? I don't think that would be fair. I don't think that's right.
Absolutely.
It's like, okay, well, you can represent murderers, but you can't represent Trump. I mean, what kind of bizarro world is that? And so it's like, why don't we just lay off people's personal, let them work, let them be productive citizens. And I think this goes to my philosophy that's kind of it's in prepare and that we should work to raise each other's level of competence, and we should encourage each other to be better. And I want you to be better. I want the boats to float, right? I want the boats to rise together and for us to encourage each other and be more positive. But I don't know how to accomplish that except through in prepare, I said it's a crisis of faith in the society and that it comes from the individual level and we all need to work individually. But you're looking at it from a public policy. I'm not sure how to address that public policy wise. Here's another one. Look at this. Got all these good examples.
Again, so it's like this idea that the argument for licensure is, well, we don't want any random person, practicing this because they could be ineffective. And the rebuttal to that is, number one, the client has, informed consent. So they get to choose whatever level of education they think is valid, as long as it's honest. And number two, like we said, we have many people who are licensed and are incompetent. So I think, there is at least a unserious case. So it's a somewhat serious case to be made for just ending licensure requirements altogether. And again, maybe not. Some people think that might be extreme.
Well, let's put it this way. Let's talk about maybe greatly limiting, because like here, the haircutter's license or the license to ride a hobby horse. I mean, the licensure it's so atomized, and there is something to said, like, how do you promote competency and prove competency? I don't know. I mean,
well, you can enforce standards where this is just like common law of it, like not having fraud, right? So someone can't lie about their qualifications. And so if you're meaningfully enforcing that, then there's no problem, because then everyone understands you can still go to law school.
But then it would be weaponized against those people who are opposed to the state by saying, well, we'll enforce it against you and not this guy. I mean,
but they're already enforcing the licensure. That's what I'm saying. The only enforcement would be to enforce someone saying they did something.
Licensure does not. You're pointing to the problem that licensure doesn't ensure competence, and in fact, really, it's basically a fundraising tool for the state. It's not really a competency issue. I don't know. I don't know. That's a tough one.
It's something to think about.
Yeah. So let's move up to some other thoughts and ideas about political or some changes in the society. I mean, I don't know. I mean, these are tough things. I think I really am a big fan. I mean, here's another. So I talked about one of the big reforms is election, guaranteeing fair elections, guaranteeing
absolutely
fair elections. I would also put very, very high on my list is empowering parents with school choice and letting parents, the dollars got to follow the parents. So if I want to send my kid to a private school or whatever, I get to determine it. And if the public schools can compete for those dollars, just like the private schools, but the dollar should follow the parent. And that is, school choice is so huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add to that. So first of all, we had a recent Supreme Court case that affirmed the right of parents to basically allow their children to opt out of certain, woke LGBT power that exists first from the people. So the power of the government to educate your children necessitates the fact that parents have the fundamental right to educate their own children. And this is similar to sort of the right to have custody and control over your child. So, for example, another case that 1776 Law Center is involved with in Washington is the case of Kurt Benschoof, who is a father who was involved in, a divorce and had split custody of his child and was basically imprisoned for violating COVID protocols. So he refused to wear a mask in a grocery store, and it ended up, getting to a level, snowballing to the point where then his child was taken from him and he was convicted, and it was a whole mess. So kind of just this whole idea of protecting the rights of parents,
personally,
right?
Yeah, I mean, I had my son, because what happened is we were very on top of my son's education in middle school, elementary, middle school. We were very on top of it. The Bob Bennett book was really helpful to us to make sure he was progressing properly in the various subjects. And he had really great teachers. We had good schools and public schools. But it's interesting, when he got to middle school, I think it was middle school, maybe it was, right in the middle of school, it wasn't the history class, it was English class. And the English class was where the politics really started getting out of control. And it's like they made him read all this propaganda by this Wilma Mankiller, some Native American person is, feminist Native American icon or something, and just communist shit. Sorry. But and so like I looked at that, I'm like, you know what? I don't like what this teacher's doing. So we pulled him out of the English class and put him onto Florida Virtual School and homeschooled him on that class. And boy, the school hated that. But that school choice, it's like, okay, I'm going to homeschool him on this class because I don't like this teacher and I should have the choice. I don't want that teacher talking to my student. And then of course we built on that. And then that happened the next semester too, because we had another bad teacher. And so I did the same thing. And they were like, really, the schools fought us. And then when the COVID thing happened, there was no learning going on at all. So we just took him out of school completely, and we completely homeschooled him last 2 years of high school. And it was great. It was, now not everybody can do that, but having the option to pull your kid out of these propaganda classes is essential. It's essential because, and I don't know that he would have been victim, but it's just punishment. It's torture. And these teachers are out to get your kids. They want to punish them. I'm just I'm very strong. I have a very strong opinion. There's two big ones that I'm strong on. Whoops. You all right?
Yeah.
Hello? Yeah. Yeah, the handbook. Are you talking about the handbook for individual freedom? That's Prepare, the handbook of signed copy at Lord of the Rings, a good fan. Prepare, I really want you to read Prepare if you haven't read that. You guys, it's available at stevegosney.com.
And Jacob Castro says private schools aren't any better, and that is absolutely true.
But
I'm going to get rid of the
And I mean, I'm Catholic, and the Catholics have a very good educational system generally,
right?
And you should just be given the choice: homeschool, private school, public school. The parents should be empowered for their students' education. The dollar should follow the child. The dollar should not go to the school district. And here's another thought about that. Like, let's say, okay, let's say it costs $10,000 a student to educate a student in the public high schools, right? And I want to homeschool my kid, or I want to send him to private school. Give me a $5,000 voucher. $5,000, that's half the money. So the public school keeps half the money, and then I get $5,000 to send him to a school of my choice, or when I prep for private school. The advantage there is, and so if every student left the public schools would still have half their money.
Right.
But that $5,000 allows me as the parent to afford a private school.
Absolutely.
So the right to live, and this is a little esoteric, and maybe it's more rural, but it's cities drive a lot of these crazy policies. But the right to harvest rain, the right to breathe,
absolutely,
the right
to homesteading rights,
the right to homestead.
Yeah, and that ties in a lot to sort of our food freedom sort of legislation, because it kind of ties in a lot. But yeah, the right to basically sustain yourself, right? The right to not, because, we have this idea of the social contract, quote unquote, of, society. But, as anyone who knows anything about contract law, right, part of what makes a contract valid is the ability of either of the two parties to have an option, right, to be given a choice. Otherwise, you're just coerced. So, enforcing, like you said, the right to collect your own rain, the right to go live rurally on a homestead and grow your own food, right? These are things that are necessary to, I guess, legitimize the claim that there even is a social contract, because you have to be a willing participant.
The Constitution is originally meant as a limiting document on the federal government. And one of the explicit rights is that we have the right to life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Absolutely.
Well, part of life and liberty is being able to feed yourself without independence. Yep. Now, that's a rural issue, but you know what? It's a human issue. It's a human right, because I want the ability to do that if I have to. That it plays to the American spirit of independence.
Absolutely.
Most people in the cities don't understand that concept, but you know what? We need to protect our rural areas too, because they're the ones that produce our food.
Yep.
Well, let's see. I don't know what other. So those are two big. I am very strong on both those two issues. I think that the persecution of Christians, the anti-Christian nature of our government, and I don't really know how to deal with that, but it's definitely strong. I mean, it's an anti-Christianity in the secular society that is persecuting, and I don't really know what to do about that. But I perceive that. I mean, a lot of the problems we have are the culture, the loss of faith, and the cultural poison that's been infected in it. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the idea that we should also support families, fatherhood,
right?
An intact nuclear family, people having children, and supporting parents rights and the ability to have children. And I don't know, creating affordability, bringing down the tax burden so people can afford to have children,
right?
So they can afford to live. And I mean, having more free markets and having more economic freedom creates people's ability to live free. And so I don't know, home ownership and families are very important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And this here, like, see, this is what I'm saying, is that school choice and vouchers support the middle class and the poor. It's not the rich people that benefit by vouchers, because rich people send their kid wherever they want. It's the middle class people like me and the poorer people who are on the edge that it might make the difference. So yeah, and I have some good friends. I'm not condemning. I have a very good friend who's an atheist, and I was agnostic for a big part of my life. I would say I did care. I should say I didn't care one way or the other. So I'm a convert Catholic. So I'm not saying that, but I do think that if you read Prepare, I lay out my arguments that loss of faith is one of the big problems in our society, in the West generally, and the ability to defend Western civilization. We need to defend Western civilization. And I think Ben Shapiro defined it as the bridge between Jerusalem and Athens. And I think that's a really good insight, which is, the Judeo-Christian heritage of Jerusalem and the democratic ideals of ancient Greece as kind of that bridge. And that's what Western civilization is. And individual freedom is dependent on the Judeo-Christian heritage and Western civilization. Individual freedom is not a concept that is found outside the Western civilization. So I think Christianity is a core necessity for human freedom. And I lay out that argument in Prepare. Where else can we go with that?
That specifically, or just other things?
Here's what Jacob Castro, what's up, Savage? Strengthen the family by weakening the government. Yeah. I mean, right now, government is now a substitute for fatherhood. It's like you can marry the government, right? And that's problematic. I know that it's a complicated issue, but government encroachment on all of these social issues too has crowded out private charity, has private out religious giving. people are paying all the taxes. They say, well, my taxes, they got food stamps goes in. Before, it used to be the communities, maybe the church and your neighborhoods. But I don't know. He's like his people making fun now. Yeah, it's good to see you, man. Good to see you, Mr. Scott. Awesome. A lot of good folks in the chat. We got good people in the chat, and I know, and I really welcome positive people adding your thoughts. And I great have, yeah, it's funny. I like the discussion. See, let's keep it positive and keep it thoughtful and keep it intellectual, and let's bring out the best in each other, and let's really brainstorm here. And if people are on the rewatch crew, which I love you, add to the chat here and add to the ideas, because the idea here is the chungster here over here is we're brainstorming ideas to improve individual freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few, I have a lot more, but so moving on, more things that were inspired specifically from your book, talking about PCAs and the abuse of that by appellate courts, specifically in Florida. That's like a huge thing, and that ties into generally, first of all, like unsigned opinions in general, but like I think there has to be a discussion about judges, and this is something that Robert talks about a lot, which is that we kind of treat judges in our society as this sacred cow that can do no wrong. And this derives from the British common law, where the judges were treated legally as extensions of the king, and the king was thought of to derive his power from God. And so basically judges under British common law had the power and authority of God. And so that's where we get this concept of like sovereign immunity, which is one thing that, Robert Barnes talks about a lot, of the fact that, you just have this sort of blanket sovereign immunity rooted in the fact that the government can do no wrong, which kind of spits in the face of everything we believe as Americans, right? Part of the reason why we left Britain was because we don't believe that the government is God, and we don't believe that judges are God. And so, like, evidenced by recent events of, we see district court judges, these, Marxist district court judges kind of just overturning the will of the voters. And obviously,
absolutely. Well, a lot of this is idolatry of and there should be a stronger, I talk idolatry, and I talk idolatry very in depth and prepare. And that's a big concept that you see. And people are always trying to deify some power, and they're always trying to put a godhead on something that is not worthy of it, a human institution or a human being. And a lot of this was, I think, was accompanied in the Constitution, which is that we shall not grant royal titles, right? That
absolutely.
No person is above another. All men are created equal. Because you're wearing a black robe, it doesn't make you better than anybody. You have power, and you have authority, and you have a role, but it doesn't make you superior, and it doesn't make you a better person morally. And I always get a kick out of like the Florida Bar magazine, and they come out with like, we've determined the lawyer of the year. And the lawyer of the year just happens to be the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. Oh my God, or the president of the Florida Bar, lawyer of the year. It's
magically.
Like, really, this is just worship of power. And you're absolutely right. And I think that the titles of nobility clause needs to be enforced and expanded. We need to have a much broader view of that, and it needs to go to these ideas that, you have absolute immunity for certain categories. If you're absolutely immune, then you are above the law.
Absolutely.
And that should not exist within our system. And it expands into law enforcement, into judges, into prosecutors, into everybody. Yep. They can get away. It's okay if you murder them as long as you're doing it through the state, right? Yep. That's kind of what we're saying.
Yeah, that's the problem with qualified and sovereign immunity in general. I see Lord of the Rings says, how do you protect, or how do you prosecute the corrupt when the corrupt are the prosecutors? That's right. Exactly the question to ask. It's like, who watches the watchmen? Lord of the Rings, you've had some very.
But see, this is where, and I'm not the best guy here, because see, my fundamental view, and I'm trying to help out with ideas and brainstorming, but my fundamental view is that the society is made up of individuals. Right. And an amoral, a faithless, amoral, immoral society will necessarily fail no matter what system. And that what we're finding is that, you've got to have a jury of reasonable men. And if your jury is made up of, if the society is unreasonable, the society is lacking in morality, there's no system that can be imposed that will work. You will devolve into tyranny over time. So we have to work on the individual level to support individual freedom, individual improvement, a moral populace. And that's where Prepare comes in. And why I wrote Prepare is because I think that, and what we're talking about, homeschooling is freedom, and empowering parents, and in supporting families, creating institutions that create a moral population. It's not the government schools, it's families, right. It's churches. That's who infuses humanity with morality. It's civilizing institutions that have been systematically destroyed. And a lot of it is the legal profession, because the legal profession sees big old targets in big institutions, and they destroy them as threats to state power. So you have, like, the church is an alternative to state power. And so we're going to sue them, we're going to take them down, and we're going to destroy them. And so every institution that opposes the state is given the whole lawyer treatment. We have a super chat here. Thank you very much for Graham, finally, son. I don't know about that. What is that name? Can you interpret that? Let's see. Same people who said no one is above the law last year are not lining up behind Judge Dugan. Make it make sense. Can you interpret that? I'm
yeah. Well, I mean, this person's basically saying, like, it's these, again, these professional managerial types, these middle managers, childless cat ladies, as Vice President Vance calls them, who will screech no one is above the law when they want to prosecute, President Trump or, freedom-loving American patriots for basically loving America and being epic. But then those same people don't apply that no one is above the law standard when it comes to prosecuting the actual corrupt actors in the government, especially when those are judges or people who are basically upholding, institutional power. And it's kind of what I was talking about earlier. It's this concept of what people say, law and order, or we want to be tough on crime, or no one is above the law. Like, the one thing you have to learn about leftists, Marxists, these weirdos, and this is something you probably ran into when they were coming after you, and took away, your basically ability to earn a living, at least temporarily, is that they don't actually mean what they say. They don't view ideas and principles as a founding, reasonable, basis for how to live. They use these talking points to advance their agenda. So, they would use any excuse to, get you fired, whether or not they actually ascribe to those principles. So if it means, let's take a step back.
And again, this is who I am and what I love. Thank you very much for coming on and inspiring my thinking like this. I haven't been able to think like I've been working, just doing civil law, rowing the boat. But I think a huge problem in our society is the infusion of falsity. We are surrounded and choked with lies in our media, and in every institution, and it's endorsed. And it's like people are rewarded for lying, and there's so many lies. And the quest for truth. One of my foundational principles is individual freedom and truth. And I've always tried to find truth. And you got to go at that with humility, because I am not the keeper of truth, but I'm seeking it. And I want
absolutely.
And falsity and lies are choking our society and are a barrier to our ability to find the truth. And I think a big problem is New York Times v. Sullivan. And New York Times v. Sullivan provides, basically, you have to have it completely eviscerated the defamation tort and created the actual malice standard. And that basically allowed, it's like, well, I don't think that lies help the society. Now, the solution there, one of the things, I don't know what the solution is, but I think New York Times with Paul Sullivan, if you read that case, that was a civil rights case. That was not a defamation case, but they went way too far. It was an activist court, and they need to really rein that in and infuse. Somehow we need to get back to the point that our society values truth and punishes falsity and lies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's sort of an interesting balancing act that has to be had there when it comes to that. And this is something, again, that Robert talks about as well, which is that what New York Times versus Sullivan does is it requires that if you are being sued by a public figure, they have to prove either that you had knowledge of the falsity or reckless disregard for the truth. I think it can't be lost on us that it's important to have some sort of standard there that protects public commenters from, SLAPP, strategic lawsuits against public participation. So protecting free speech while, again, like you're saying, protecting the truth. Because what you'll have these, and this ties into immunity, right? Because, so for example, 1776 Law Center was involved in representing the Covington Catholic kids way back when. It feels like forever ago. Nick
Salute.
Sandman.
Yes,
and
yes.
they sued members of Congress, notably Elizabeth Warren, and the courts ruled basically that there's just like members of Congress have blanket immunity from being sued for defamation because of whatever, some, mutilation of the, speech and debate clause or whatever. And so I think it's absolutely correct that like we need to have some sort of balance between protecting the right of free speech and public participation, but also preventing these like deranged lunatics from just spreading falsehoods without accountability under the guise of,
and it's not just, and there's people that are like trollsters. Hey, David, good to see you. There's trollsters. There's people that enjoy destroying and just want to destroy the society. There's malevolent figures. I've got people that are actively stalking every word I say and misconstrue everything I say just for the point of hurting me because I'm a conservative Catholic white male, right? And I'm the everything they hate, and so I'm vocal, and so they just want to hurt me. And so it's like it's really been horrible what I've gone through. On the other hand, and that's why I'll say that we've got to stop this destructive thing. But it's interesting because sometimes when I'll talk about like I had a stream on the Ukraine-Russia thing, because I'm a very big fan of history. And I look at things, I like watching politics. I like seeing history unfold and conflict. And I like studying it to figure out what drives conflict and human conflict. And the Ukraine-Russia thing I thought was very interesting. And I did a live stream on when it first started on Rumble, right? And boy, once some Russian bots got wind that I wasn't all in for Russia, and I have friends who are Russian, I have friends from Ukraine. I love both countries, and I want them to stop killing each other because the society is self-destructing on both sides, and we need to stop that war. It's just horrific because I love those people. But when they found out that I wasn't all in for the Russian government, it's like the people started like fake. There were all of a sudden these fake people started coming in my chat that were live people that were like agents that were saying things like, oh, well, I'm glad that we're all Nazis here. And like they were faking like this whole false flag idea that the lefties love to do. And these enemies, they like to say, oh, and they were doing that. I had to like start banning people immediately because they were doing this Nazi Holocaust denials and all this stuff, trying to paint me like a Nazi. It was really bizarre. It was bizarre because there's this organized groups out there. And in this case, it was these Russian bots who were actively trolling and creating things in the chat to try to get me banned and trying to label me as some fascist or enemy. And it was bizarre. And it's very organized and it's widespread. I look at my X feed and the craziness on the X feed, it's all propaganda. Absolutely. It's like, again, I want truth. I'm trying to find the truth. And I hate the fact that our social media and our media generally and our media outlets are completely divorced from truth fact-finding. Instead, they're all about propagandizing.
Yeah. And so first of all, Lord of the Ree talks about a book recommendation. I think that's a good book recommendation. I think in general, seeing different sides of ideas is a good idea. What you're saying, what you're touching on at the end there about like media not being truth seeking. This is something that Mike Benz talks about a lot. I don't know if you're familiar with Mike Benz. He has become very popular, in the past year or two in the sort of right-wing space. He's a former corporate lawyer, turned, speechwriter for the White House, turned State Department official. Now he runs the Foundation for Freedom Online. And he actually is big on exposing the fact that a lot of media and a lot of internet censorship actually comes directly from government, from the intelligence agencies, and their different NGOs and cutouts. And so there was this brief period where the sort of, I guess, naive take by people, on the freedom side is like, well, Facebook or Instagram or Twitter is a private company, so they can do whatever they want, in taking down accounts, until we kind of realized that it actually was not those private companies doing it on their own volition, but it was the FBI and Department of Homeland Security and CISA who were actually coercing them to ban these different people for freedom of speech. And so it kind of became that they were like quasi-state actors.
Well,
I think it's important to consider.
Very important to understand this. And as conservatives, I think that we have really woken up to this idea. And I should say I did. And that is that, normally conservatives are like, we're against big government. We want smaller government because big government is the enemy of freedom. But we have also woken up to the fact that basically big organizations, big institutions, big corporations are also the enemy of individual freedom. And
because they're de facto governments.
Yeah, you've heard of the Robert Conquest's laws of was it 3 laws of politics, and I think the second law is any organization that is not explicitly right wing will eventually turn left wing over time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's because of simple game theory, and that is leftists promote fellow leftists. They take into consideration that quality over other things. So if you have a hiring committee and you have 5 people and 2 of them are leftists, and they will only vote for fellow leftists, and the 3 other people are conservatives, and they'll vote for the most qualified person, right?
Right. So then it's 50% of the time you'll have
that will warp the hiring so that everybody becomes a leftist, and you turn into Harvard, which has 99% of the faculty is hard left. And that happens with all HR departments and all large organizations. And we conservatives need to come up with a solution to that. One of them is individual freedom is important. Big government and big business, big institutions are a threat, just like big media is a threat to individual freedom.
Yeah. And Chaucerian Fraud says, do y'all remember when lefties were anti-corporate and anti-government? That's what I saw growing up. I don't see that as much anymore. And that, again, ties in perfectly to this idea that, like, they never actually believed in anti-government and anti-corporate. They only believed it when it was the, quote, right-wingers who were in power. So that, they were pro-free speech in the 90s when the people controlling speech was George W. Bush. But as soon as they took power, they kind of took off their mask and revealed that they don't actually care about that. They just care about winning, and they care about hating you, the ordinary American patriot.
And it's really, I think that the core of leftism is driven by fundamental human flaws of jealousy and hatred towards others, and division, binary division. That's the basis of Marxism, and then also it also becomes an idolatrous concept of idolatry towards power. They lust after power. It's a power is their godhead, and government represents that. That's why Trump is such a threat to the left's vision, because their godhead has been replaced by their enemy. So it's like Satan taking the throne of Jesus, right? To the secular power worshiper, that is an abomination. And it's basically a missed priority. I mean, he's a human being. I remember back in the day, Trump was just another media personality having a TV show. When did he turn into Satan and Hitler? And
it's the same thing with Elon Musk. It's the same thing as anyone. And it kind of, again, it reinforces the fact that these people don't actually believe these things. And they just use these epithets against people who stand in the way of what they're trying to accomplish. And I would add one thing. You mentioned of like these Marxists kind of are fundamentally built off of hatred and division. And it's specifically the hatred of the good, the right, and the beautiful, because they don't hate, criminals. They don't hate, terrorists. They hate, the American Christian Catholic, churchgoer like yourself.
But they hate God, because
Yeah,
what it is
exactly.
they hate morality. Because
Yep.
and Jordan Peterson explains this really well, and it was a real insight, breakthrough thought back in the day when he was first coming out, and that is that all principle, God is a judge, because anytime that I assert a principle, that principle is also a judge on my actions. And I use the example because I was raised by a single parent, single mom, and I'm proud of the fact I had a great mom, and we overcame a lot, and I've overcome that. I don't use that as a victimhood. I'm just saying that, but I can say it's a disadvantage not to have a two-parent household, right? I
Absolutely.
would
And
rather have
specifically
had,
with one father and one mother
right, one. I want to have a mom and a dad raising my kid. Now,
who are married.
it sometimes it's better, and I covered this in Prepare. Sometimes it's better not to have dad around. In my case, I'd say that was true, but but it's definitely a disadvantage, and you got to acknowledge statistically, it is a disadvantage not to have an active father involved in the family. Now, I can say that, but then when people say, like, if they're a single, because I'm a parent, I'm a single child, parent of or a son of a single mother, right? I can recognize the statistical reality, but that statement is a judgment on everybody who's a single mother, right? And so there's a natural reaction to say, "Oh, well, what are you doing? You're judging me." Well,
Hmm.
every statement of morality is a judgment on our own self. And that's why God's morality, it's a marriage is sacred, marriage should be protected, marriage should be for marital, all these positive statements that I make. Every time I make positive statements towards the ideal, those are judgments on our own failings. It's better not to lie. If I say lying is a sin, what do you mean by that? I don't want to be
Right.
judged by God. I want to be able to
Right.
lie and get away with it. I want to be able to defy God. I want the church to endorse my lying. I want the church to endorse my sinning, right? Because I want
Absolutely.
God to be in my control. I want to be God. It's a rejection of faith. It's a rejection of the Judeo-Christian morality, and it's a desire for us to reject God.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say what you were talking about there is a very important thing that I feel like a lot of people need to understand. Like, the way to properly retort this is that, for example, if someone is living an unhealthy lifestyle and that lifestyle causes them to become diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and after this, sad diagnosis, they decide to turn their life around and get healthy, and they end up in a much better situation than they were before, that does not mean, right, that you have to say, well, I hope you get diabetes, right? Because again, so it's like this idea that just because someone had something bad happen to them, right, and then they turned out okay, that doesn't mean that the bad thing is a good thing, right? So if I say, I don't think people should get diabetes, then the person who said that, well, you don't want me to be healthy. Well, no, right? Same thing with single family households. Well, I think that every child should have one father and one mother. Well, I was raised by a single mother and I turned out just fine. Do you hate me? Like, no, I don't hate you. The fact that you ended up okay does not change the fact that I would have rather you had been in a better situation to start out with. And so we
Right?
can't
Is
get
it
caught in
better?
that trap.
Yeah, I mean, these are all questions. So I think that, and I will say thank you. This is Chancery and Fraud. I will say that, I know that I'm really thank you for being in the chat, because you've added a lot of good thoughts here, and you're really excellent chats on that you've done here. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Mr. Scott Awesome. I love my chats, and yeah, Kathy Trout here. Yeah, and this is the thing. I mean, I love my mama, and I'm a proud son of a single parent, and I think I've overcome a lot. But I think it would have been better had I had a father, a dad, rather than an absent, the person that I did have in my life who was a negative force. But we all have challenges. We're all, like, I wish everybody was rich. I wish everybody was healthy. I wish, all of those things. Well, just because you want everybody healthy, it doesn't mean that I'm condemning people who are sick, right? This is I want you to be healthy. I want you to overcome. I want you to be better. I want you to take the life that you have and be the best that you can be with what you've been given. Some of those are just cards you're dealt, but we can't deny the ideals. But it's a selfish, it's an egotistical, individual cultural flaw that we have as Americans, that we want to control morality. We want to say, I want my sinful life to be endorsed.
Right.
Yeah, like this is a stupid, yeah, the right side of history. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But yeah, that's one of those what do you call it? Slogans that's devoid of any kind of meaning. It's just rhetoric. Like you say, people are, I find that the left, well, I should say all, because I have some very good friends who are progressive types, liberal types, who are very much believe, and I have great conversations with them about seeking the truth. But ultimately, they believe that there is a truth. And I talk about this in Prepare also, which is about the finding truth. And you've got to agree on that. You've got to respect each other. You've got to believe that there is a truth, and that you need to, and through the debate, go at it with humility, that I don't have all the answers and that we're struggling for the truth together. Prepare was inspired by that friend who's a lefty progressive who was challenging my beliefs and says, are you an originalist? And he knew that I took those questions seriously. And the whole book got shot off by that question, because it's easy for me to say, go conservatives, go conservative court. I'm an originalist and that's it. That's wonderful. Go team, right? But I'm like, wait a second, what's an originalist? And what does that mean? And do I really believe that? And so, and that was the kind of the starting kickoff point for Prepare. And because he was seeking truth and I'm seeking truth, it inspired thinking and it inspired growth, and it helped me understand my own faith better and my own thought processes better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sort of if I were to define my sort of ideology or viewpoint, I would absolutely boil it down to just the pursuit of truth. And actually, one of the 2 Substack articles that I've written, I kind of wrote both of them and I got really tired of writing. I might get back to it later, was about how do you determine what is right and what is wrong? And more specifically, how do you determine who to trust? And I kind of weaved in this concept of the scientific method as well as the kind of federal rules of evidence in court, and kind of combine the two to have a framework for how do you analyze who's right and who's wrong. And basically, like, to simplify the entire thing, number 1 is with the rules of evidence, right? You vet information based off whether you would admit it into a court of law. So if it's, different exceptions to hearsay, whether it's, goes to the credibility of the person. And then number 2, through the scientific method, you check, you form a hypothesis. So let's say you want to know who was right about the outcome of the 2024 presidential election. You had certain left-wing pollers who said Kamala Harris was going to win by 400 electoral points. And then you had other people, for example, Robert Barnes, for example, Richard Barris, the People's Pundit, who actually got the exact margin correct. And you look at people's predictions over time and you see whether that was the truth once we figure it out. And over time, you evaluate people over how often they made successful predictions, and especially attribute value when those predictions were going against the mob, quote unquote. So if everyone said Kamala was going to win, but they said Trump was going to win and Trump won, maybe that means they're a little bit more reliable. And that's kind of over time, that's how you determine the truth. Part of,
but this is where the mass media and these big media organizations have really, really failed, because their pundits, their talking heads, and their institutions have been so violently wrong, and there's never any consequences to these institutions, which are supposed to be the truth seekers, supposed to be the fact finders. There's no consequence to them for being 180 degrees wrong. I mean, I don't know how to bring in institutional accountability to our media. I mean, I'm a little baffled on that one, because it's so much. A lot of the things we're dealing with are sins of wealth,
right?
Because we can protect ourselves. We can use money to insulate ourselves from reality. That's why the rural people are generally much more in touch with the earth. They understand what it takes to get fed. They understand what it takes to maintain a house, what it takes to live, right? When you live in a little condo, in Brickell, in Miami, and live in your condo on your keyboard, and your whole world is your little isolated view of the, oh, look, I'm living in $1 million condo overlooking Brickell Bay and Miami Biscayne Bay, and you know, you got the food brought to you and everything. It's like, oh, I got all this money, but you know, I don't want to actually. Now I also want to feel good about myself. I want to have moral cheat. You know, I'm just going to buy morality by buying into an ideology that gives me the reward of feeling morally superior without actually having to do anything, without actually being introspective, without actually having to do the hard work of seeking the truth, without actually having to treat people with respect, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said about sort of like the rural people versus people living in their condos, you know, have a better touch of reality. And this actually ties perfectly into something you kind of really eloquently identified earlier on, which is that the government fundamentally tries to destroy any system that it views to be in opposition of its own power. And combining those two, sort of this rural idea and the government attacking systems, something that 1776 Law Center focuses on a lot is the Amish. The Amish community has been basically at the forefront of the sort of fight, quote unquote, between the sort of, as Robert explains it, the Bill Gates dystopian control grid versus freedom. So, for example, we were talking about homeschooling. Homeschooling jurisprudence in the United States comes from Supreme Court cases involving the Amish. A lot of our food freedom and medical freedom sort of legislation and a lot of the clients that 1776 Law Center has represented, for example, the Amish farmer in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Amos Miller of AmosMillerOrganicFarm.com, he has very good food, by the way, is being harassed and harangued by the government for basically raising livestock and creating food that people want and love, but goes against, again, this sort of corporatized, mechanized, industrialized food system that is not in touch with, you know, how God created the world and intended for us to be eating and, you know, raising livestock. And it's interesting kind of to see how the government persecutes the Amish because they are separate from, you know, the big tech grid. They're separate from big ag, from big pharma. And they're in touch with nature, like you said, because they live, you know, they're very deeply religious people. So they have morals. And they, JKD Buck 76 says Amish dude with a website. Yeah, he personally does not run the website. There are other people who are not Amish who run the website for him. But yeah, and the website is AmosMillerOrganicFarm.com. I'm not sponsored or anything. It's just, there's really good food there. Really good milk and everything. But yeah, it's just fascinating how the government targets the Amish specifically, but because they're deeply religious.
Any institution threatens state power. I mean, you know,
right.
Family,
especially religious ones,
religious families. You know, and you know, they say, what kind of conservative are, how far do you want to turn back the clock? Right. And I think the Great Society program has been an absolute disaster and an abysmal failure. So I would definitely turn back the clock before the Great Society under Johnson. That was a disaster in every possible way. Now, it's interesting because in my book, Prepare, I quote a lot of FDR, but it's interesting because I tended to agree with early FDR and not later FDR. So, you know, if it's interesting. So if I would say that I'm still trying to figure out exactly how far I turn back the clock, but I will say that early FDR might be the peak of my political, when I think the later FDR became quite a little more left, although Wilson was a disaster too. And my buddy John C. Wright, who's the author, I don't know if you've seen my interviews with him. He thinks that the whole, because I always thought I was an Enlightenment guy, you know, 1776 and the Enlightenment was the peak. But he says, oh, the whole Enlightenment was a mistake and the whole Reformation was a mistake. You know, go back before that. So I don't know. I think we do need a question, but I will definitely say I definitely stand against the Great Society as a solution. I think it was a disaster for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Do we want to go back to the list of?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I don't know how much longer you want to go. It's been great, but let's hit some more highlights. What are some of your favorites?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine. You know, I have no time limit, but if you do, just let me know. But I'm fine to keep going. I have so much.
Okay, how's it going? We gotta have some chats because I don't make any, talk about somebody said people don't read. I don't sell any books, 0 books. My book sales have flatlined. And I really wish
Right.
people would get Prepare at least. I've also, part of it too, because I believe in education and homeschooling and the value of religious upbringing. I've designed my 3 children's books, Brucey and Scooter and My Difficult Dog. Those 3 books are designed to teach your children the values of moral and Christian thought in a children's story without being over the top and too overly religious. And I will say each one contains a prayer, and teaching your child to pray. My Difficult Dog. Let's see what we see. Scooter has the prayers before meals, and Brucey has the Serenity Prayer. And My Difficult Dog, let's see, he has a prayer too. I forget what one it is now, but anyways, I'm just throwing out a little promotion because I wish people would. I want people to read and it's not that I want them to buy the books. I want them to read the books, and because I have something to say. I write the books because I have something to say. And
you put a lot of care and effort into them. It's evident. Like I did some, cursory reading of your books, and it's very clear that you have a lot of very deep insights. Like this is not just like some person who's like, oh, buy my book because I want you to buy my book. You clearly have a lot to say. And so I completely agree. People should definitely read your books. Go read Steve Gosney's books.
And since we're promoting things, can you go ahead? I know I didn't want to like dox you, and I know you're anonymous and you don't want to be kind of out there, but maybe you can promote the 1776.
Yeah, absolutely. So 1776lawcenter.com. So that's 1776lawcenter.com, as well as you can find information from Robert Barnes at vivabarneslaw.locals.com, as well as on Viva Fry's YouTube and Rumble channels. And then myself, you can find me on X and Substack under this username, The Chunkster. But yeah, those are definitely places to find.
And Viva, I will say, I've been on a couple, laid back laws with Viva, and I just wanted to go on Viva's show, but he never gave me the honor. I think he's like, yeah, another guy, but when writing these books,
real quick, I mentioned in the on the locals board that I was coming on here, and he actually liked that message. So maybe he'll
reconsider. I'm a lot less on the media anymore because I'm not selling any books and I'm working, and my life has completely changed and it doesn't quite fit as well. But I try to come on occasionally and do my thing. But my books, I still want people to read them because I think I have something to say, and I wrote them for a reason. And it's like, if it was up to me, if you promised to read it, I would give it to you, but I can't guarantee that. So I've got to have a law. But in fact, if you're on Kindle, the Kindle program or whatever on Amazon, I think you can download almost all my books for free. So so it's not like, and in fact, Scooter is available as a free ebook on my website. So Scooter, I do want people to read these things because I want parents to have a tool to teach their kids their faith, and have a resource to teach their kids their faith and talk values, because we don't talk values. People have been shouted down about talking their values to their kids. It's like, we don't talk about that, but why not? That's the most important thing. So anyway, go ahead. If you were going to go back to your list.
Yeah, of course. So we have, there's a lot more of like certain Second Amendment stuff, repealing a lot of unconstitutional gun laws. I don't think we have to go through those one by one, but just like, the 1934 National Firearms Act, the licensing FFL provision of the 1968 Gun Control Act, the 1986 Hughes Amendment to the Firearm Owners Protection Act, all these are very provisions.
Specific. And there's a chapter, I think it's in Prepare, about justifying citizen individual ownership of firearms and how it is protection. And because some people and conservatives, usually the mainstream conservatives, are embarrassed by some of the justifications for it. But I laid it out, all the reasoning behind the Second Amendment. In fact, that where that speech was, That article was derived from a speech I gave to Saratov Law School in Russia, because
No way.
the Russians are very interested in the death penalty and Second Amendment. And so the one of my buddies at Saratov Law School invited me to speak on something. I said, well, how about I speak on the Second Amendment, because that's what the Russians are interested in. So
Right.
that article was basically derived from that speech I gave to Saratov Law School.
Yeah, absolutely. Two questions that are kind of, I guess, that I could answer. Number one, M. Logan says, is 1776 Law Center a legal aid kind of thing? Yes, somewhat. So basically, Barnes has his own legal practice, Barnes Law LLP, and then he founded 1776 Law Center, which, as up until now, has been helping out with sort of defraying the costs for people who are targeted under food freedom, medical freedom, political freedom, and financial freedom, and sort of helping raise funds and support for them. And then part of the reason why I'm doing this project is that the intention is to expand 1776 Law Center into a sort of, catch-all freedom organization that has information on, for example, filing FOIA requests or, sunshine law requests, whatever the state provision is, as well as helping people with certain medical exemptions, and basically kind of a one-stop shop for freedom for the ordinary person. So yeah, that's kind of what that is. And then Shosarian Fraud says a lot of this is overturning previous precedent, right? The idea is that these would be like laws to be passed through Congress, through state legislatures and the U.S. Congress, because like you're saying, it's very difficult to overturn precedent in the courts. And it's no help the fact that judges are often the people, that come from the same ideology as the people who are creating these bad laws. So yeah, this would not necessarily be something that's going through the courts, although 1776 Law Center is involved in that, but these would be legislative agendas to support. 1776 Law Center, in conjunction with Richard Barris, is also going to be thinking about, how to help independent, freedom-loving candidates run for Congress, run for Senate. They'll be starting with, kind of helping a few key races in the 2026 Senate primaries, specifically in South Carolina, South Carolina, North Carolina, Texas, and Louisiana. But in general, yeah, it'll be like a big thing.
Well, thinking a little bit, I just lost my thought there. Oh, I know. A big solution to another positive prescription generally for individual freedom I just thought of is de-evolution. And that's going back to the concept of federalism.
Right.
This goes back against the idea of centralized power in government, but also centralized power in big business and big corporations, is to go back to a divided thing. One of the reasons we're so divided is because everything becomes federalized and everything becomes an existential crisis, because the vote that we make is, it's going to end abortion forever, or it's going to end this, and it's all. And it's like all these things begin. If we re-empower the localities, we push power as low down back to the people, and I think that Newt Gingrich talked about block granting back. Instead of these big federal agencies like the Department of Education, taking that federal funding and block granting it back to the states, back to the localities, re-empowering our local government, because I always found that the best government was that was closest to you. And the ones that were the most responsive to the people. I mean, I know what streets need to get fixed around my neighborhood, and I can communicate that to my neighbor. The further it gets up, the bigger the problems, and the less solvable they are, and the more money it becomes. So federalism and de-evolution of power back to the lower rungs of government is also an essential component to what this federalizing of everything is really out of control.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of, but yeah, that's decentralization, returning power to ordinary people. So this is kind of, I know the term populism sometimes has negative connotations, but at least as definitely Robert Barnes talks about it, populism at its core is returning power to ordinary people. So not appealing to the masses and demagoguery, but like you're saying, returning power to ordinary people rather than to a select group of elites or the government or corporations or licensing boards or professionals or, global organizations, giving power to individuals is absolutely like a core thing that 1776 Law Center is
Well,
focusing on.
somebody had mentioned Thomas Sowell in the comments, and Thomas Sowell to me is the premier intellectual in America has produced a living. He's still alive, so I will say that the premier living intellectual. And I've read a lot of Thomas Sowell. The Vision of the Anointed to me is one of his great books. I know people recommended Basic Economics. I always found that a little harder, but I love the Vision of Anointed. But he's a great writer and a great intellectual. And it's interesting because he was a Marxist all the way through college and all the way through his doctorate degree. He studied, I think it was with Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. So he was a Marxist after getting his PhD. And he says what turned him into a free marketer was 6 months in the Department of Labor. And it was interesting because his story was he was tasked with trying to figure out if the minimum wage laws had a positive or negative effect in Puerto Rico. And so he spent 6 months and devoted his efforts towards figuring out the solution. And he went to his boss all excited because he says, I figured out a way to measure whether or not this is a positive or negative impact on the people of Puerto Rico, this minimum wage law. And instead of getting a positive reception, he got like, what are you thinking? Half of our agency's budget goes towards enforcing the minimum wage law. So we don't want to solve this problem. We don't want to know the answer, and that was like, he woke up and said that there's a big institutional investment in the problems that the government agency is tasked to solve. They don't want to solve the problem. It's kind of like, remember the March of Dimes. Once the March of Dimes solved the problem, March of Dimes didn't go away. They just changed their focus, right? And that's the similar, government's even worse. They don't want to solve the problem. They want to create the problem that they can solve. And the further up the government chain it goes, the less accountability there is. And so de-evolution is a big concept that I would go for as far as fixing some of our societal ills, because the rural people can live how they want. I can live how I want in Miami or in Florida or wherever. And what is right for me in Miami and Florida is not necessarily what's right for me if I'm living in West Virginia. Those are two completely different situations. And we have to have local solutions to these local problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chaucerian Fraud, I think, disagrees with us somewhat, or at least with me, that the pandemic has damaged their views of democracy and populism.
I would
sure posit it's the opposite, because the only reason that the pandemic ended and it didn't escalate to a total dystopian, like rounding people up into camps, was because of populism. And was because there were people advocating for individual rights.
When was the moment that the pandemic, when did we all declare that everybody could stop wearing masks and the pandemic was over? Do you remember that declaration? I don't ever remember that happening. It just kind of faded away.
So there were a few different moments, and actually in different places, it kind of lasted a lot longer than it should have. But yeah, like the only reason that certain lockdown provisions, forced masks, forced vaccination cards ended was because of the public backlash and because of populist causes, people revolting against that. And I would raise that, again, the rise of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the sort of COVID distance.
Well, I think it really woke it up. It opened the eyes of the conservatives to the tyranny.
Absolutely.
And it destroyed authority where authority should not exist. It destroyed all these authorities who were lecturing us, and they're sitting there and they're arresting surfers out in front of the California surfing alone, and they're going there arresting because you're not wearing a mask while you're surfing, right? There was such delusion. I remember there was this local lefty newspaper columnist who's like, close the damn beach. Like closing the beach is going to stop COVID. But it was just tyranny. Every tyranny from all these institutions lecturing us, and that Fauci. So all of these institutions lost so much credibility, and that's a good thing because they don't deserve the credibility. The people need to be empowered. The people need to be aware that these big institutions are liars, and they are nothing but institutional power centers to destroy individual freedom.
Yeah, and Chaucerian Fraud responds, I disagree here. That in fact, those things were only facilitated because there was this centralized government control. right? The quote unquote public sentiment of people who wanted lockdowns, that was not organic. That was not grassroots. Those were government funded propaganda operations, information warfare that was meant to propagandize the public into wanting or thinking they wanted these lockdown provisions. And again, Mike Benz has brilliant work about how there were actual programs in the government, in the FBI, in the State Department, in the Department of Homeland Security, that were using military and military adjacent assets and operations to basically strategize on how to propagandize the public on COVID. So again, it's this centralized
I'm not
of the government that did this.
And I'm not a big conspiracy buff, but I've become I've moved towards the conspiracy theories a little more. And one of those things is that I'm not convinced that the deep state did not push the whole COVID agenda as a way to rig the elections, to create, these mail-in ballot situations, to create these situations where mass fraud could occur. I do not have confidence in that election process. That's why it's really important to fix that process so that the election process, so that I want to have confidence in the process, but my confidence was greatly shaken. And I'm not certain that whole wasn't a way. They saw another Trump term. They didn't want it. So how are we going to do it? Remember when Bush got bamboozled into like the government's going to shut down and all the quantitative easing and all that stuff, because it's like, the whole society, everything's going to collapse and you got to act. It's an emergency. And then old Bush went along with it. Right. And then now we have never ending quantitative easing, never ending debt. And the government's debt is just out of control. But it all started with that whole fear that if we don't do this, the thing's going to get locked up. I mean, I think, and what's his name? The presidential candidate, Mitt Romney, who is not my favorite guy. But
not at all.
But he said something. I remember one time it was like this whole bailouts for all these big companies like GM. And remember when they did all those bailouts, and he was the presidential candidate, he's like, they should be allowed to go bankrupt. Redistribute their assets to more efficient companies. That's the system. That's the bankruptcy system. Why are we protecting GM as this big company? That big company has to exist. What interest is it me as the little taxpayer to bail out that big company? Why did my taxpayer go to bail out the big banks? Why does Bank of America need to be subsidized by little small town me? How is that fair? I mean, so I think that's right. If the big company, if it's too big to fail, it's too big. And here's another concept that I will push, and a lot of my lefty friends tend to agree with me. We should be much stronger in vigorous enforcement of antitrust laws.
And monopolies.
Monopolies and big business. If it's too big to fail, it's too big. If I'm subsidizing some big company because they're so big that if they fail, it'll hurt me, then we're subsidizing them. Then they should break that up into smaller companies so that it isn't too big to fail. Because I don't ever want to have to bail out some big company. It's not fair to mom and pop.
Yeah, and the more you look, the more you realize, like Jacob Castro says, there's actually nothing free market about protecting these monopolies, especially when you realize that most of these monopolies are created by government, by the state, right? These companies would have gone under had they not been rescued by our tax dollars that were, robbed from us, by the government. And we're forced to prop up these failing large corporations.
And this is, we're talking populism here. We're talking populism. It's like, why did the government bail out these big banks, banks, and they didn't bail out mom and pop who's got a mortgage for it? They were merciless in foreclosing on our homes, right?
Yep. And it was like in COVID too. You couldn't go to your church, you couldn't go to your small local coffee shop, but you could go to Walmart, right? You could
There's another example. Yeah, big business is the enemy of individual freedom, and
absolutely.
And all those anti-Wall Street people, what are they called? The Wall Street Occupy Wall Street folks. Yeah. Hey, you sold me. You won. I agree. Big business is bad. I'm against it too, because it's a threat to individual freedom. And all these examples that we're pointing to, they are basically, because taxation is out the barrel of a gun. They are forcing me to give up my money to give it to the government, to give to somebody else. And when that somebody else, I mean, what moral basis is there ever to take some poor person's tax dollar and give it to the rich guy? I mean, at least you can say, like, if you tax the rich and give to the poor, at least there's a Robin Hood effect, right?
Right.
But there is no moral basis to tax the poor and give to the rich. But that's
Absolutely.
what we've done. That's what we have turned. And the left is now supporting that.
Yep. Well, it ties back to the idea that arguably they never actually believed in this idea and they just used it to gain power. And also this ties into the concept of like foreign aid, for example, and USAID, which was closed down, again, due in large part to the work of Mike Benz, funnily enough. And the idea of foreign aid is that we are stealing from poor people in rich countries and giving the money to rich people in poor countries. And that I heard someone say that, I don't remember who, but it was very powerful because it's, they'll frame it as, well, we're actually supporting the small guy. But like you said, they end up actually stealing from the poor to give to the rich.
Hey, be nice. I want my chat to be nice. So Chancellor Fraud and Eileen, both you guys, I love you both. Be nice to each other. Just, recognize that you disagree and have a little humility. Don't fight in my chat. You're both wonderful people. Okay. So, you both have been a valuable asset. I don't want you bickering because you disagree. Okay. We disagree. And like a lot of the stuff I'm saying, this is just, I'm positing it. We're thinking.
Oh, yeah. We're spitballing here.
And part of it is that communication is thinking. So by doing this dialogue, I'm not saying that I have all the answers, and we're throwing out concepts to advance the cause of human freedom and generalities, and we're talking amongst ourselves to maybe check, because maybe I'm in the wrong direction. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm right. I don't know. Yeah, like here, Dennis Prager. Exactly. I love Dennis Prager. He prefers clarity to agreement. And
Absolutely.
And having an honest discussion with people, and part of that is being honest with each other, being humble, and not insulting each other and impugning each other's motives. And it may be that the other side's motives are bad and evil, right? That may very well be, and those people you should not communicate to. I agree, but anyways, I'm just talking. Dennis Prager is a blessing too. He's a fascinating guy.
Yeah. I'm wondering if anyone in the chat has specific questions or specific input, for any food for thought for us to discuss, because it's been a lot of one way us to the chat, but I feel like I'm sure a lot of people have.
The chat's doing great, and I have some great chat, and I love you all, and thank you for being here. And I will never forget how much the common person supported the government and corporations destroyed his lives. Yeah, and what they say. I am for liberty over free markets, and this is where
absolutely,
and this is where people. I mean, free markets are definitely the way, because they promote individual freedom, and also it is the most efficient way to distribute goods, and it's the most moral way to distribute goods, and it's the most efficient way to produce and to create wealth. However, that being said, there's a limitation on markets in that ultimately capitalists will sell you the rope to hang themselves by, right?
Yep.
That's what I think we need to recognize, that free markets result in monopoly, free markets result in unemployment, free markets can result in unfairness and losers and winners losers. We need to have a vigorous bankruptcy system. Here's another concept that I've promoted, another idea that I think is positive, and that is the bankruptcy college debt, student loans should be dischargeable in bankruptcy. But if they are discharged in bankruptcy within 10 years of the debt being incurred, the school that sold them the debt is on the hook for half the debt.
Right.
Because there needs to be accountability for schools selling useless degrees to kids, propaganda degrees, and then they get out and they can't function in the world stage. And then they declare bankruptcy, and that's a societal cost, right? And student debt is not dischargeable in bankruptcy. So it should be, because we need to free up people from making bad choices, because in order to facilitate free markets. However, if that school that sold that useless degree that results in that, there's some accountability there, and let's assign it at half. That's another proposal I have.
Absolutely. Let's see.
Yeah, this is true, and this is where we're talking. I would be for the breakup a lot of these big corporations, especially ones that are choking innovation. And I don't know. I think No, free markets do create monopolies. That's the goal. The game of monopoly was created in the trust busters. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt was a big trust buster because the game of free markets will eventually result in monopoly. And that's the game of monopoly teaches that concept. As you play and people acquire wealth and acquire properties, eventually there become tenants and there become people, and eventually people go bankrupt and there somebody wins everything. That is the game of monopoly, is an illustration of the free market that runs unchecked. And so what happens is the government has to come back in and shake up the market, redistribute the pieces, and not punish people, but redistribute pieces so that the market then operates efficiently again, because monopolies are inefficient. Monopolies are threats to tyranny. Monopolies threaten our freedom. And in free markets running unchecked do result in monopoly. That is a free market. I'm not, we have to be honest and to say that it's not perfect. It's not a perfect system. I don't believe in the Ayn Rand, capitalism is, unchecked free markets are the wonder of the world. I don't worship the free market, but I do assert that the free market is the best system for the economic system. Right. So I don't know.
I would actually, talking about Jacob Castro and Hunter Brooks, who agrees with Jacob Castro, I actually might be inclined to agree with their perspective. I think maybe you're not disagreeing with them as much as you think you are, Steve. I think the point that they're making is kind of what I was saying, which is that a lot of what is labeled free market is actually, like we said, the too big to fail bailouts. And like Jacob Castro said, barriers to entry create monopolies. Exactly. And those barriers are often created by governments. So these regulations that we have, strict regulations, are, in the name of protecting the little guy, but what they actually do is just solidify and entrench the control of the bigger corporations who have the resources to defend against those regulations, right, and can pay for those fines, whereas the small guy can't. And so I actually think there's a lot of merit to the idea that actually what is sold to us as the free market that is causing these monopolies is often not as free as we think. One example, for example, is informed consent. I think my radical idea for business is that we should ban all advertising components that are not a direct, convincing argument on the merits of the product. And the reason I say this, for example, advertisements that you see on television, on anywhere else, you're not seeing them explaining why their product is good. They're showing you a celebrity that's endorsing it, or an attractive woman who is endorsing it, or some things. They're manipulating you. So the problem is, this is no longer a free market because they are not, you're not a willing, informed participant because they're manipulating you, right? So like in a contract, for example, or in consent, right? The idea of like statutory rape, you are engaging in behavior with someone who the law has agreed does not have the requisite ability to make an informed consent decision. Same with someone who's intoxicated. And so even though maybe they did sign off, you can say, well, this person voluntarily bought our product. They were doing so under duress, under fraudulent pretenses, because they were manipulated. All these companies have so much money that they pour into creating advertisements that are circumventing different parts of like the human brain to make you want their product more. And I feel like that's not the free market because it's not free. The person is not making the decision based off of the product. They're being controlled, basically.
Well, here's another, Eileen made a good point here, and this will bring another idea to bear in our little discussion towards human freedom. And that is that a big problem is this. I think there should be a blind admission process. I think that all these little check boxes where you have to identify with your little race or class or sex or sexual.
I always answer those wrong when I was doing
I know, but those need to be
applications.
completely done away with. And
Yeah.
I think that standardized testing, it should be almost a blind admission process. I know that there are some colleges that sign up to that, but this idea of victim essays and promotion, the college entries is that's something that really needs to be fixed. And I'm not sure, just do away with the Ivy League.
Yeah, literally.
What's your, I gotta say, I'm getting a little tired, and I got a big hearing tomorrow, a big thing at work. I got to work tomorrow, but so give me a couple more because I'm really enjoying the conversation. And that's
Amazing.
right. Jacob has nailed me here. And I enjoy the intellectual discussion. It's very interesting and it's been a blast. So now's your chance, folks. If you want to get your chats in.
Yeah. Any questions, we can answer them. And again, anything that you guys say in the chat has a non-zero chance of making its way up the chain. And I would mention that 1776 Law Center is not, if I were to be a betting person, I would say that your efforts would not be futile if you were to propose something, because I think that the 1776 Law Center is going to be very successful.
Well, and you're working in a volunteer position to develop some policy ideas, and
absolutely
give Viva Fry and Robert Barnes a copy of Prepare for Me, and maybe they'll read it, maybe they won't. But if people are on the rewatch crew, if you want to put things in the comments section of either the Rumble channel or the YouTube channel, I know that you're going to follow this, and I really appreciate everybody with their thoughts. We've had some great discussions from all my chatters. Yeah, and I've got a couple things I got to do, so I gotta cut it short. We've already been going for about an hour and 2 hours and 20 minutes. So we've had a great discussion, man. This has been a blast. Thank you very much.
Oh, of course.
I really have enjoyed this. And so upcoming, I'll just tell my people here. I've got the I'm gonna have a stream with Bronca. So watch Andre Bronca's channel. He's going to be coming to Miami. And then I will also say I'm going to have a meet and greet in Miami with Nick Starro, Swedish labor lawyer. Nick Starro is going to come to Miami, and we're going to have a meet and greet in September. I think it's going to be September 20th. I think that's Saturday, September 20th at dinner time. We're going to have it, and it's going to be announced. So we'll have a meet and greet. If you're in Miami in weekend of September 20th, that's Saturday night, you come out and meet Nick Starro and I in Miami. So that'll be fun. So that's coming up. So, and I'll try to keep, it's been very hard for me to stream, and I haven't had a lot of ideas, but this has been a blast. You've given me happiness and mental stimulation. So thank you very much, the Chungster. Any final comments or any final words here?
Yeah, I guess one thing, Shosarian Fraud has a question. If I believe that the local legislative process in every state is an easier route than appeal up through the courts, absolutely yes. By nature, the courts do not want to change the law, especially if it's you wanting to change the law. They're perfectly fine if it's the leftist NGOs that are wanting to change the law. That's fine. But you, the ordinary American patriot, if you want to change the law, the courts will not be inclined to agree with you. However, the local legislative process, kind of like what Steve said earlier, we want decentralized power. The easiest way to accrue power is to start at the bottom and work your way up slowly. So at your local legislative bodies, whether that's a city council or a school board, advocate for policies, and you'd be surprised how easy it is, or at least how accessible it is, to make substantive changes at a small level. And those things propagate. So yeah, absolutely. Start small, start local. Petition your school board, city council, state legislature. Like, these things happen. Like, this is real. As Robert often says, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled is convincing the world he does not exist. And the greatest trick the system ever pulled is convincing people that you cannot resist. So, part of the method of control that the regime uses is trying to convince you that there's no hope, that we shouldn't vote, we shouldn't try things, it doesn't matter. But what you see is, actually, if you put pressure in the right spots, you will absolutely achieve much more than if you just throw your hands up and give up. Oh, because it's not worth it. Well, then, yeah, they're going to get steamrolled.
I'll tag on to that by saying that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a famous Russian dissident,
love him,
and his prescription to tyranny, to anti-tyranny, is to live not by lies, and that is his prescription. So don't seek the truth, and don't lie, and don't take lies into your heart. Don't live by lies. Look introspectively to make sure you're living the truth inside and out in all ways, And that's the best way that you can fight tyranny, is to live not by lies. So, and we need that in our society, but use that individually as a good guiding post. And that's a good way to fight tyranny on the individual level. All right. God bless you, Rod. Yes, and that's right, Rod Dreher. He's Lived Not by Lies, a great book. If anybody wants to pick, I would highly recommend that book. All right.
Yeah.
Well, hang out for a second, and we'll shut down here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the super chats. Thanks for buying my books. If anybody does, I don't know if anybody does anymore, but if you do, please do. And we'll see you around. Bye-bye.